Okay, well, welcome everyone to our first ever panel discussion called Introduction of the UC Natural Reserve System and Opportunities for PhDs. We're really glad that you're here, and this is being recorded today so that people who aren't in the audience will have the chance to also hear from these experts about the NRS. And before we get started, I wanted to introduce the NRS to you very briefly. We have a lot of good information that's on the web, but this year, the Natural Reserve System of the University of California turns 50 years old. And over that course of 50 years, it's grown to encompass these 39 sites throughout the state of California. There's an excellent website for the entire UC NRS that you could turn to get all the information about these different sites. And you can just see how vast it is, how many different acres are encompassed with these sites, and that they are the gateway to over 1 million acres of public land. And so why do we do this? Why does the University of California have the Natural Reserve System? Well, throughout that 50 years, it's adhered to this mission of contributing to the understanding and wide stewardship of the earth and natural systems by supporting university-level teaching, research, and also public service. There's a great deal of community outreach that occurs at these really quite different and amazing natural protected areas throughout California. And UC Santa Barbara is a really important player in the overall UC Natural Reserve System, in that it manages 7 of those 39 reserves. And you can see that many of them are very close to where we're located on campus. In fact, the closest one is right next to campus, Coal Oil Point. And then you can see that there's a pair up near Mammoth, the Valentine Camp and SNARL, the Sierra Nevada Aquatic Research Laboratory. Some of these photographs are just demonstrative of the beauty of these different reserves. We have a huge amount of education at the university level, outreach and research that's happening at the reserves. And just to give you an idea, you can see there's tens of thousands of user days. So individuals multiplied by number of days that visit all of these reserves over these past few years, just to give you an idea of the use and then of the activity. We measure our success in large part by the number of research projects that are going on, the number of classes that are taught, and of course including the number of publications. And you can see there's a lot of graduate students that are performing their own research at the reserves. And you'll hear today from our experts about the different types of activities, including the different types of research projects that happen. So it's just to say welcome, and here's our brand new logo for the UC Natural Reserve System over in the lower right here, and then also our logo celebrating 50 years. And with that, my name is Trish Holden. I'm the faculty advisor here on the UC campus for the UC Natural Reserve System. We also have a whole many layers of support underneath the Office of Research, but I'd like to introduce now our distinguished panelists. And really, we're very lucky to be here with these 5 people. These are very committed naturalists and scientists who've been involved with the NRS for decades. And they know more about it than collectively maybe anybody else does in the system. And just to go down the line here, I'd like to first acknowledge and welcome Dr. Andrew Brooks, far to the right. He's the Deputy Program Director of the Moorea Coral Reef Long-Term Ecological Research Site, and he also directs the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve. So if you've driven by Carpinteria, don't blink your eyes as you go past the marsh, because that's Andy's reserve, and that's what he manages. And if you ever want to do research there, visit. Dr. Brooks is your go-to. Then immediately to his left is Dr. Kevin Lafferty. He's a senior ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey and adjunct faculty at UCSB, and he's done research at many of our reserves, including Carpinteria Salt Marsh, Coal Oil Point, and Santa Cruz Island Reserve since the 1980s. In the center, we have Dr. Chris Sandoval, and she's the director of the Coal Oil Point Reserve, the one I mentioned that's adjacent to campus. Before working at the reserve, she taught at UCSB and the College of Creative Studies, and today she manages a very rich set of programs in conservation education, and she acquires lots of funding to support these programs at the reserve. To her left is Dr. Sue Swervick. Dr. Swervick is the executive director of the UCSB Natural Reserve System, and she has been for the past 13 years. Her PhD training is in ecology, and her research in ecology focused on structure and dynamics of communities and regulation of insect pests. She's participated in many field research programs at many of the reserves and across the entire UC NRS system. And then last but not least, to the far left here is Dr. Lyndall Lauren. He's the director and manager of the Santa Cruz Island Reserve. So as you look across the channel and you see this enormous expanse in front of you, we have a field station there as part of the UC Natural Reserve System, and Dr. Lauren has been managing that since 1970. His background, his academic background is at UCSB in his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in the areas of avian and small mammal ecology and behavior. And he says for his real job as director of Santa Cruz Island Reserve, he spends most of his time coordinating visitors, facilities, and vehicles in support of the academic research efforts on the island. And so really I think that's demonstrative. What we have here is a spectrum of expert panelists who can tell you about what they do at the reserves. And particularly when they're directors of reserves, they're facilitating the implementation of this mission for everyone who benefits. So welcome, panelists. What we thought we'd do here is start with a few questions, go down the line, and then please feel free to interrupt from the audience at any time with your own questions. And then we'll have a freewheeling kind of discussion at the end so that all of you can learn as much as you'd like from this group of experts. Okay, so I'd like to just throw out a question to the panelists, and any of you could start by answering, just to have you explain what you do with or in the NRS. In other words, describe your work, just to demystify it for us.
So I think one of the things that makes our jobs most attractive to us is that they really do encompass a wide range of duties and activities. So Carpinteria Saltmarsh has one employee, me, which means I do everything from emptying trash cans and arranging for the porta potty to be cleaned, all the way up to approving research applications, assisting people with the logistics of their research, managing users, managing the resources that those users might need to access. It involves maintaining databases of past research projects so that people have some idea of the history of what's gone on before them, and also to make sure that no sort of ongoing project is going to interfere with another ongoing project or might be affected by a previous project, for instance. There's a lot of sort of personnel decisions that get made. For me, on a short-term basis, I need to hire somebody for a week or 2 weeks to do something. There's a lot of interacting with the community. So we have an advisory committee that has members from county government, local residents, the city of Carpinteria. We meet 2-3 times a year, and so there's a lot of sort of opportunities there to influence not only what goes on in the UC Reserve, but within the Carpinteria Saltmarsh sort of at large. And so it's really hard to define what an NRS director does, and it changes on a day-to-day basis, I think. And so you just sort of go with the flow and figure things out as best you can. The overall goal, of course, is to maintain the reserve in as pristine a state as possible to enable university-level research and teaching, and also to bring in the public for public outreach activities, to sort of increase the environmental awareness of the general public. And so anything that sort of furthers those major goals kind of falls within the job description.
I think a core point job as a director resembles a little bit what Andy said, but we have unique things. So besides approving applications, interacting with researchers, developing curriculum for classes that come visit, there are unique things of each of the reserves. And unique things, for example, of Coal Point Reserve include the fact that we have public access. So my job involves balancing the public access with the need to protect the reserve. Also, I invest a lot of my time and resources enhancing biological resources in the reserve, particularly dealing with endangered and threatened species and doing restoration. This is unique to our reserve because it's a small reserve and it had some degradation in the past from agriculture. And it's so rare to find a reserve in the coastal zone that I felt it was a priority to restore it. So as you can see, as the reserve director also makes decisions about what's a priority to invest your time. And to me, this is one of the most rewarding things about the job, is to think about what those priorities are. And sometimes the priorities change because emergencies or needs. So as with Andy, we deal with things of like stewardship, administration, fundraising, teaching, biology. We go to the field. You know, I came to this field because I am a biologist. I like to be with animals and plants. So I do still make sure I spend some time doing that sort of thing. There's quite a bit of teaching. You know, both Andy and I think, spend a lot of time with classes that come visit the reserve. After spending 10, 20 years like we have in a reserve, you end up knowing it really well. You know the species that are there, you know the natural history, you know ecology. You learn things from researchers that are there. And so we're sort of the interpreters of all that information to the people that come visit. And I think all of us enjoy teaching in that way.
Yeah, so, you know, I'm not employed by the reserve system, but because Christina and I are married and we've lived on the reserve for a long time, I'm sort of the associate director of the reserve. And I thought I'd point out that one unique thing about many of the reserves, and actually a difference with Andy's job, is that when you're resident at the reserve, that means, you know, you're basically doing your job 24/7. And at a place like Coal Point Reserve, you don't know when you're going to be needed to do something. And so it might be that there's a bonfire in the middle of the night, or it might be that you know, somebody comes to you with a bird that needs to be taken to the Wildlife Care Network, or that there's a fire or whatever. And so that's one of the things about being a resident director that is a bit different from most other jobs and other resource management jobs. It's kind of like, I'm reminded a little bit of people I know that are park rangers out on the Channel Islands and so forth, where you don't always get a break. It also means you're a lot more intimate with your job and so on. So, and then my other role within the NRS is as a researcher, and so I use the system quite a lot for places where I can do my research. I also have my students, my graduate students, working on their PhDs in the reserve when I can, because it's you know, really set up precisely for that. And probably talk a little bit more about why that self-selects a bunch of UCSB PhDs, which is not exactly the way land managers typically have their qualifications. So, but Sue.
You want to talk first, and then I'll talk about Jennifer?
Yeah, pretty much reiterate what everyone said. Diversity is, the opportunities for what you're actually doing, who you're interacting with. In my case, Santa Cruz Island, it's one of the largest reserves, so the diversity of topography, habitats, everything else. That's just what makes it a really amazing part of the job. The island is one of the few reserves where the university doesn't really own the property, so we don't have some of the responsibilities of the day-to-day care of the place like some of the other managers do. We operate on property owned by the Nature Conservancy, and we're surrounded by Channel Islands National Park, so they're partners, so you do interact with them a lot, and that kind of adds a whole other flavor also to what goes on out there. But it's, you know, a lot of it's just the people that you interact with. As Chris mentioned, yes, you get a little bit of time once in a while to exercise the training that you had when you thought you were going to be a real scientist, you know, and whatever you got your PhD in. But the reality is more you're really helping all the other people to get their jobs done.
Well, my job's a little bit different from the rest of these guys because I don't actually manage a reserve. So in my job, I'm responsible for the management of all 7 reserves. And we have 6 reserve directors. That one reserve director manages 2 reserves, and he's up in the Eastern Sierras. So really one of the functions of my job is to look after kind of the programmatic and budgetary planning for the whole UCSB NRS. And I work closely with Trish, who's the faculty director. And then so we actually have a campus office where we have a business officer and a financial analyst. And so at that campus office, we're responsible for the full administrative functions of the NRS. And that includes, you know, all the financial stuff and, you know, personnel and purchasing and all that kind of stuff. So there's just those sorts of business things that happen, which if you're a scientist, you know, you go into science because you don't really like business sometimes, but it comes around and you get to do it anyhow. So you should realize that as you progress in your careers, you know, you're going to have to learn things you never thought you'd have to learn. But, and then in addition to that, really I see my function as supporting the reserve directors. So, you know, the reserves, there are all these remote sites, but they're also part of the university. And so they actually have to deal with the structure of the university and all the policies and guidelines and things like that. So part of my job is to help translate that into a form that hopefully will work on reserves. And then, you know, I deal with like a full range of things. So everything that they deal with on their reserves sometimes hits the office, and I will deal with that sort of thing also. So on a daily basis, you know, I'm either writing grants or helping with management plans or dealing with personnel issues or, you know, going to committee meetings, or it's just this wide range of things. And so that's pretty much what the executive director does.
I think the audience might be very interested in hearing how you got into the NRS. What was it that, yeah. How did you get pulled into that vortex?
Yeah, I think it's actually kind of a similar story for most of us. So we all did our PhDs here at UCSB. And mine involved field work in the Carpinteria Salt Marsh. And so I worked in the reserve for 5 years. I'm a fish ecologist, and so my work mainly centered on sort of fish community dynamics within the reserve. And the reserve director prior to me, Wayne Farron, was retiring and moving away. My position's a little bit tricky to fill because it's not actually a full-time position. It's a 25% time position. And so it's hard to find somebody who only wants 25% of a job. You know, English or independently wealthy or something. And so I was fortunate enough that I was, at the time, working for a large project that was funded by EPA that provided a lot of my salary. I now work for the Maria LTR site, which provides the rest of my salary. And so I was able to sort of take this 25% time position and manage the reserve. And just because I had worked there for 5 years and was fairly familiar with the layout and the, you know, the biological community that was present, as well as sort of how everything worked, Wayne thought that I might be a, you know, an interested candidate. So he approached me and I said yes, and I guess it's, what, 14 years later and I'm still there. So.
Yeah, I'll go first. So I was an undergrad here starting in 1981, and and in that capacity, I would go out to Sands Beach, which was Coal Point Reserve, and do all the things that undergrads do out there.
The aforementioned fires.
Yeah, yeah, and so, you know, that was basically where I sort of felt I grew up, and it was a special place to me. And then for my PhD, I had spent time going out to Santa Cruz Island and also out to Carpinteria Salt Marsh, so I became familiar with the NRS and what its mission was, what its actual mission was, as opposed to just a place for people to recreate. Christina and I knew the caretakers, they were called the caretakers of Coal Point at that point in time, and we would go out and, you know, go to their place and party with them and so on and so forth. So we were sort of socially integrated into that aspect of Coal Point Reserve. And because we were friends with these people, we also knew that eventually they were going to leave the reserve. And so we talked a lot about, hey, wouldn't that be interesting to go out and be caretakers at a Coal Point? Now, at that point in time, the caretaker position was, there was no salary involved, okay? There was a 10 by 40 trailer that was built in 1966. You couldn't close the windows or lock the doors on it, okay? And it was, there was not, I think the annual budget for the reserve was in a couple of $1,000 a year. So we were looking, but you didn't have to pay rent and you didn't have to pay utilities, and we were, had finished our PhDs recently. We had a tiny baby, et cetera, but we applied. And what was interesting about that is that because it was such a lousy deal from most people's perspective, there was hardly any competition for that job. You know, now I think when you look at the fact that there's a full-time salary, there's 2 staff, there's a nice house, blah, 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 that it's a much more attractive position for somebody to come in and think of it as a career as opposed to what we were looking at, which was a place to live in, a place that we really liked for, you know, to solve the Santa Barbara rental problem, basically. So that's how we got into it. And I would say that as with many things in life, especially in careers, we eventually worked hard to make the position what we wanted it to be. We visualized. And it involved a lot of arguments between Christina and I, at which point I ceded to her, you can be the director and I will be your assistant.
We chose. Thanks, Sue.
Hey.
Yeah, don't ever share a position of director of whatever, the same thing in the same job is really difficult to have. You know, you're already spending all day on your job, and then you go to bed, and yeah, you did this way. No, you should have done that way. This doesn't work. We early on recognized we each needed separate jobs. So I think Kevin explained the background and how unique this was, that we kind of grew up in the job. But I'll expand a little bit about how we went from a condemned trailer with no salary to a place with $1 million view, a salary, and 3 staff. So when we started in the reserve, we were really thinking as this a step towards a faculty position someplace else. It was a temporary thing until we both found a job that would be suitable for both of us. We both being in academia, we knew we didn't want to be separated. And 2 jobs in academia in the same place is really hard to get. So we were prepared to kind of take our time finding the right job. So I started teaching at UCSB, just part-time, and living in the reserve, free rent. What I didn't know is that I was going to fall in love with that place. You know, you start walking around, and you start learning about this, and you start learning about that. And I always had a passion about conservation. And even though I did ecology and evolution for my background, I've always cared about it. It was like an internal activism that I had. And so I started, well, maybe we can do a little bit of this in the reserve if I get some grants and do a little project here and there. So I started getting grants, and it became a snowball. One project led to another and to another, and I started interacting more with the faculty that came to visit and doing little tours here and there. And so it developed because I really liked what I was doing. So about 2 or 3 years after I started the job, it was clear that if I could spend more time in the reserve, not just the 10% that I was supposed to, I could get even more grants and do even more things, and that the place actually deserved to have all of that because it was really special. So we talked within the NRS system and say, hey, what about if we try to get a position for there's a salary so I can then quit my class, my teaching, and spend full time? And this worked out. I think the university saw the value of the reserve, and they saw that it was a good investment because I was bringing money in. So in a way, we created the job. We made the reserve more active. The reserve had already been there for 30 years. But I think what a person there that cared and want to move things forward made a difference. And I see this in many other reserves. There's lots of opportunities for you to develop things in different directions depending on what you want to do. That's one of the things I find the most fascinating about the reserve system. You know, most jobs, I think you go and there's an exactly prescription about what you're supposed to be doing on that job. Not a reserve director. There's no manual. You say, manage it. There's a mission that is very clear and that I was very fond of. And I think this is an important thing that you see throughout the reserve system. Most people, I think all the reserve directors, they care about the mission, which is support research and education. And they develop with their own talents and the skills, they developed and support that mission.
Well, I was also a graduate student at UCSB before many of these guys, except Lyndall here. And so I got introduced to the reserve system as a graduate student by either going out and working at reserves. I went out to Santa Cruz, for example. I studied ecology, and I worked on intertidal marine organisms, population dynamics. But and then I started teaching as a TA. I took classes to Carp, Salt Marsh, and to Coal Point, and went out to Sedgwick before it became a reserve. We were doing research out there even before it became a reserve. So, and I've spent my whole science career doing field studies, some of them major field studies. And so when you do that, you recognize the value of having places like reserves where you can actually go and work and you can set up an experiment with whatever you need and have it run for 2 or 3 years, and it doesn't get damaged or it doesn't get disturbed. And that's like, you realize how valuable that is for field scientists. In any, it doesn't have to be in ecology, it can be in any field. And so I was working as a researcher here on campus with a research group, and we kind of came to the end of some big major experiment that actually kind of wore me out. And I started thinking, well, is this what I want to keep doing, or do I want to spend the last 15 years of my career doing something a little bit different, but still being involved with science and research? And the position that I have came up, and I realized that what was going to be cool about this position for me was just the challenge of it, that it's something where you get to use every analytical skill you've ever developed. And that's actually really pretty cool. So that's kind of how I came into the job, was first from research and then into something that I knew I was going to have to give up most of the research. I still hang on to some few things, but that it would be really valuable in that context to support research that other people are doing. Oh, yeah, you got that.
Yeah, I would say that in one way, the job at Santa Cruz Island is similar to some of these others. I mean, a lot of it's being in the right place at the right time. That's getting to be harder to be true in one sense, working for the university, because they put out solicitations for jobs, and you have to have a pool, and you select from that. But on the other side of it, you can sort of pre-position yourself to be better prepared. A lot of the reserves have opportunities to maybe not particularly get paid, but at least internships. We actually have an internship that we do collectively through the reserve group here called the Often Internship Scholarship, and we rotate it around. So it's a good way to get an introduction to see what the jobs are available. In one sense, things are a bit different than when I started out, back in the 70s, one guy doing everything. Nowadays, sometimes that's what it ends up, but the reality is the university doesn't like that. They want the electricians to be doing the electrician jobs and the groundskeepers to be doing groundskeepers jobs, and the academic guys to be separated from that. So, but a lot of these reserves, certainly Santa Cruz Island, way out there, you're isolated. You basically have to kind of be able to do certainly at least basic stuff in almost anything and everything. And I guess I would also put this in the context that, there's a broader group of opportunities than just the UCSB NRS. There's the whole UC NRS, 39 sites now, and looking at a couple others around the state of California. There's a program called the Organization of Biological Field Stations, OBFS. That's the national, now international group of field stations, and so they have a website with job postings all the time. So checking that out and looking, one of the, I like to look at it like the good, bad, and not very often ugly, but the bad side maybe in one context is that people like us get in these jobs and we never give them up. And so the turnover, the opportunity for new young people to come into these positions is sort of infrequent maybe in one particular position, but there has become a fairly broad array, and to come right out of college and step into something that's going to be your lifelong dream and career is probably unrealistic now, but if you start working in the area you like and almost working for peanuts, you're pre-positioned to take advantage, and the people that are looking at filling those jobs will recognize your commitment and your skills that you've had on-the-job training, so to speak, and probably position you better when they start evaluating.
That's a great segue into my last question for the panel. If you had one piece of advice to give to our audience here about how to get involved with the NRS, what would that piece of advice be?
Wow. What would it be? I think, first of all, as Chris said, there's no manual for this. So you have to do a self-assessment and really figure out what kind of person you are. And if you're not somebody who deals well with unexpected circumstances, you get a call at 10 o'clock. This is the Carpinteria Fire Department. Your shed's on fire. This probably isn't the job for you. We all have schedules, and the first thing in the morning that goes out the window is usually the schedule. So if you're a person who likes a challenge, as Sue said, if you're a person who really likes to utilize all of your analytical skills as well as skills that you may have in woodworking or plumbing, gardening, any of those things. This job covers so many different skill sets that you have a chance really to do anything you want to do. And as Chris said, you really have a chance to sort of form the job into what you want it to be within certain limits. And so I think the sort of most important attribute is be passionate about the environment, because that's your office. Be willing to accept uncertainty in your sort of daily life, and then be curious about how things work, because ultimately that's what's going to get you out of bed every day in the morning is, what's next? What's the new thing I'm going to see today? What's the new research project that I'm going to sort of help facilitate, and what new information is going to come out of that? More and more of the reserves, I think, are offering broad opportunities, because the reserves are now beginning to function more as a network than they have in the past. So as before, we all managed our own reserves and we sort of focused to some extent inward on what was going on in our reserves. Now there's a greater emphasis on focusing outward and using these reserves as a network. And you can see from Trish's earlier slide, the reserves are distributed throughout the state of California. And so the types of scientific questions that can be answered using data or research opportunities that have been developed at the reserves are incredible. And I think a lot of the exciting new science that's going to come out of the NRS is going to be people that take advantage of this network of reserves rather than just focus on a single reserve. So if that kind of potential excites you, then this is probably a pretty decent job.
Well, I think this is a time to sort of compare. Let's go look at the Channel Islands National Park, which I would say is another place where there's a lot of land management, and I work with those people all the time. There's nobody on the national park staff that has a PhD, really. I mean, there's a couple people, but it's not. It makes it very different from our group. If you work for the Channel Islands National Park and you're in maintenance, you know how to do maintenance, or you know how to do something about conservation biology on a particular species, or you know how to run a boat or whatever. And those are very specific tasks. This is a big organization, and they can sort of subdivide the things. What's consistent with all of us are really the following things. One is that we all have PhDs, and that's important because, and that's not true for all managers, but what it means is that we understand what PhDs need, and that's our main client base. So either having a PhD or knowing what PhDs need is a really important aspect or prerequisite for this job. The second thing is we're all sort of spent a lot of time in Santa Barbara, so we've done two things. One is we've decided that this aspect of geography is important personally for us. And because one of the things about working in conservation or for the NRS or any of these things is that you do trade off the value of where you get to live and that sort of life, quality of life aspect with the big bucks, because it's not, you're not going to make a ton of money working for Channel Islands National Park or NRS or any of these other organizations. So you have to decide that your priority is to live in a beautiful place. And then to get hired, you have to convince, I think, the people that are looking for new NRS directors a couple of things. One is, can you do just about everything? Are you a jack of all trades? That's a really important skill set. And the second thing is, do you get along with people well? Because frankly, a lot of your job is to interact with scientists, most of which are not the easiest people in the world to deal with, because they all have huge egos and they all think that they're super important, and many of them are. So, and then the general public is also somebody that you have to. So somebody who can explain and interact with a grade school class and a big ego scientist at the same time, those sort of people skills are actually pretty important. And then I think that the other thing is that because the job is not well defined, that initiative is another important aspect to have. If you're waiting for someone to tell you what your job is and what the boundaries are, it's not going to happen. So you kind of have to be willing to figure out what those are going to be.
Yeah, and to expand what Kevin just said, if you like to be your own boss, this is the job for you. Because when you're out there, you have to make decisions on the spot, and you have to figure out how to do things. But now you have the opportunity to prepare yourself, because we're having this very interesting panel where you can hear from us. When we came along, there wasn't such a thing. And I did not have good people's skill. I did not know plumbing and electrics and how to operate a tractor. My dad had a farm in Brazil, and I knew I loved to learn things, and I was always following him around. But when I came here, I didn't have those skills that I have today. But I was willing to ask around and look and trying to troubleshoot. And today you guys have YouTube videos, so I use that several times a week. How to, and so if you like, and if you're willing to learn things that way, you know, self-taught, it's great. And I think Kevin mentioned a really important thing about getting along and work in group. I am a better person today because of this job. Because when I finish a PhD, I'm kind of cocky, you know, oh, I have a PhD, and I'm going to be in academia, and as a faculty, you sometimes become just too full of yourself, particularly as a student, because you're just beginning to feel important. And then in the job, I had to learn modesty, getting along, understanding somebody else's point of view, which oftentimes is completely opposite than mine. So I think this is an interesting aspect of the job, is the huge wide range of people you need to interact with and get along and understand. So if you're just willing, you may not have to know all of this, but you might have to be willing to learn all of this stuff and be open to things.
Well, I think what I'd say is that I think the most important thing you should realize, the value of getting a PhD, isn't that you're learning a lot about some particular thing. It's that you're learning how to analyze problems. And you're learning how to, you know, figure out solutions. And that's the most important part of this job, is that you're a good problem solver and that you love a challenge. And you guys, that's all true. I mean, otherwise you wouldn't be getting a PhD. It's too hard, you know. And I think that the things that you need for this job, the other thing you have to realize that everything you've ever done in your life, pretty much, you would use in this job. I mean, you know, thank goodness my father taught me to change the oil in the tractor when I was a teenager. Because, you know, that's a valuable skill that I have now in terms of understanding what's going on in this job. And so what I would suggest to you guys is, if you're interested in these jobs, is try and go out and find opportunities to volunteer at reserves, or, you know, reserves have docents, for example. And not only UCSB reserves, you know, there's a Royal Hondo that has a docent program that's close here. It's not part of the UC system, but, you know, there's a lot of opportunities outside the UC system too. So, and also go and look at job descriptions. There are a lot, as Lyndall said, they come up on the OBFS website. There's the Natural Lands Management website. There's, you know, look for these things and find out, how are these jobs described, and, you know, what skills are they asking for? Because you're going to be more successful if you have a wider variety of skills, and this is the time to, you know, try and learn some of them.
Yeah, I would, you know, the land trusts, the Nature Conservancy, there's a lot of other property owners that are working in this same venue that maybe don't have the strength of the academic component, but they're still probably have some bit of that, but more stressing just conservation and restoration management things, state parks, federal parks. And, you know, I would just be parroting what everybody else has said, but, I mean, self-sufficiency, being self-reliant, being really flexible, and good humor. You know, if you've got that kind of stuff, you'll be able to fit well in almost any of these kinds of places. But again, there's a lot of opportunity out there. You just have to kind of broaden your horizons maybe and spend a little effort looking.
There is one thing that nobody mentioned, which I thought should, and that is that the directors are continually raising money for projects.
That's true.
And
We try not to think of the downside of our jobs.
Yeah. And I mean, that takes a certain type of personality to be successful with that, and it's a kind of a never-ending challenge. And so demonstrate, like, you know, if you've demonstrated the ability to get a proposal funded, or, you know, you've worked for a nonprofit or things like that, those can be really good skills that the reserve needs, because there's never enough money to sort of meet the mission of the reserve.
And I think I would say, from my perspective, if you're young and haven't gotten your feet wet in that area, do it now. Don't wait to become, you know, teaching the old dogs new tricks is true. You know?
It's too hard. Come on,
some
come on, Linda. You can do it.
Some of us do it more reluctantly than others.
So we'd love to open this up to questions from the audience. Yes, Elizabeth.
I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit more about the challenge these balancing, you know, like doing research and having the ability to do some of your own research and answer some of your own questions that it's about the science to do with the day-to-day tasks of fundraising and management.
Well, I can start with that. So my job description has 40% of my own research. I haven't done 5. And partially it's my choice, because the job description allows me to do that. But I think one of the things of all of us is we accept this huge leadership role, and with the leadership comes responsibility. So you want these big things to get done. So I leave my research aside. So I try to do research now that is in the reserve, instead of my own research was not in the reserve. It's in the mountains, which is Forest Service. So now I try to do things at the reserve that I can do research. It's not the kinds of questions that I prepare myself to, but it's more conservation kind of questions and monitoring. But I find that pretty satisfying as well.
Yeah, for me it's a little easier because my position's not full-time. And so I have this 75% of my time that I allocate to doing my own research. And then the other 25% is the reserve. And so for me, it's actually kind of the opposite. It's how do I effectively balance those two really different jobs? And as you know, your research can become all-consuming, and you know there is no 40-hour week in the reserve system or in research. And so it's just a matter of how do you sort of balance that. And so I went into the position as director of Carpinteria Saltmarsh knowing that I was going to have this time that was set aside for me to do my research, and that would make it somewhat easier to do that balancing act. Yeah.
I think it's a really important question that depends on what your ultimate goals are. And I'll sort of put it to you this way, you know, if you were my graduate student and you had an opportunity to go do some work in an NRS site, you know, if that's your long-term goal and that's what you want to do and that's going to be your career, then doing research or not, basically I would suggest that the research will probably end up being something that you might describe as more of your hobby that you do because you really enjoy doing it. But if you want a long-term career in research, then it can be problematic if you start moving into a job where there's a lot of competing interest in your time, because then you just start to sort of lose pace compared to all the other people that are moving in that direction. I do full-time research, so for me, the reserve management parts that I do on the reserve, that's my hobby. And it comes as sort of, you know, in a different model from the rest of these people, mostly because I'm not drawing a salary to manage the reserve, so that's the way that I look at it. But I don't think it's impossible. I think that if in many of the reserves you could probably have the opportunity to set up or create and define your role in such a way that did maintain an aspect of research, perhaps more through collaborative efforts with other scientists that are doing research on the reserve, as opposed to, you know, the sort of the model that most PhD students use for doing research.
Yeah, I came to the reserve system after spending 20 years doing research. So, you know, kind of had that opportunity also. And when I came into the job, I thought, oh, this is great. I've still got stuff I want to do. And, you know, the bottom line is it just takes too much time to do my job and with the NRS. And I maybe get in, you know, half a dozen trips to a field site. I've got long-term project going in a boulder field and stuff like that. But so it becomes, you know, really a minor part of what I do, and it's almost like it's a hobby in a way. Finally, I just have to get out in the field because, you know, the office is killing me or something. But I know that at other, and maybe Lyndall can speak to this a little more, that, you know, it's different for different reserves too. That some reserve directors might spend a little bit more time being able to do research, but it would pretty much have to be site-centric. I mean, you know, you're right there. You can set stuff up. But if you're really interested in research and that's the primary interest, it might be frustrating for you to have a job like this because, you know, the people who are really good at it are the people who are really dedicated to it. So.
Yeah, I'd just say that, I mean, the basic mission of the reserve system, and going back to the beginning and the overall structure, is that these are places for the academic, the research faculty, for the university. They're not places for the staff to have a place to do their research. So that said, a lot of the jobs, I'm not sure that all of them, but they do have some, maybe a small percentage allowed for your, you know, in your job description. So in my case, it was like 10%. You could, part of your evaluation could be based on how much research you were involved in. And oftentimes, you find it easier to work in areas of restoration conservation, which is kind of directly applicable to what you're doing with the site usually. And as Kevin mentioned, collaboration partnerships with other researchers as part of their research team. You know, some of these remote spots where somebody has to spend a lot of time to get there, like the island, you know, somebody has an ongoing project, there needs, you know, 5 minutes worth of something done once a week or whenever. You know, it's a lot of effort for sending somebody from campus. You know, you almost have to go overnight, 2 boat rides and all this, whereas I'm out there, I live there, I can run out and do something in 15 minutes and save them a lot of trouble. So working with a team that's doing something that you're interested like that really works well, and you can sort of keep your hand in. I mean, it's important to have that connection because you are facilitating that community, and to be aware and, you know, keep on the cutting edge, so to speak. You know, that's just another asset that should be part of the system, and, you know, makes it what it is. But there are also just strictly the caretaker sides of things too, that you don't have to be if you don't want to be. You can, you know, reserve stewards and, you know, part-time stuff like that.
We have another question.
Yeah, I was wondering what the best way to potentially align PhD objectives is with like available research system. If something going through the funding opportunities, or if there's a basis of something that through the opportunities available.
Would these be opportunities to do research or to be supported?
Right, to do competitive PhD research.
Well, basically, they're all pretty much open. I mean, you just need to do the application, talk to the director, figure out how your particular program would fit into what's there and what you want to do. I mean,
Talk to the reserve directors for one. Go to the websites and become familiar through the website with the nature of that reserve. You know, is it a geographical location that's meaningful to you in your research project? Does it have natural resources that are meaningful to you? Chris has a answer as well, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the roles that I have at Coal Point Reserve is to support students, PhD, masters, and even undergraduates doing senior thesis. And sometimes people come to me and say, you know, I want to work with this animal, and this is a closed reserve to the university. What could I do? So we kind of have a list of projects in mind, or we can also help develop a project to frame your question and hypothesis, because we know the resources very well. So really encourage you to talk to each reserve director, explain what you want to do, even if it is in the really early stages of your thinking, and we can brainstorm together.
And I would say that the reserve really doesn't support research, with the exception that there are fellowships that are designed to support graduate student research, and but like the Worcester, I'm in the Matthias. Sorry.
Yeah, there are some limited. Some reserves have, you know, endowment funds that they can support projects on those sites.
But those are not project specific. You know, you propose what you want to do on the reserve, and there's a competitive process for some of those. But that's really, I would say, most students that work on the reserve aren't supported by the reserve system to do the research. They're at least directly. I mean, the system supports and facilitates what they do, but doesn't fund research directly. If that was help clarify what your question was about. Yeah.
There's a coastal fund, particularly for this university. Since you are at UCSB, you can apply for coastal fund money to work on the reserves, and we get quite a few grad students there that are supported in part by coastal fund.
I think that was absolutely, both of those questions were outstanding. And I'm really happy to hear Chris say, talk with your reserve directors, because they know their sites and what are the open and interesting questions and opportunities at their sites. And that's a fantastic thing to know. I think we're running out of time, actually, but I just really want to thank again our distinguished panelists, Dr. Andy Brooks, Dr. Kevin Lafferty, Dr. Chris Sandoval, Dr. Sue Swervick, and Dr. Linda Lauren. And thanks all of you for coming and participating, and hopefully you'll know how to be in touch with them. Any of them are more than happy to help you get connected to the NRS. And thank you for your attention and for your participation. Okay.